So, to my mind, definitely this acquisition, as far as the acquisition is concerned, normally when you acquire shares, what goes out? Money goes out of your pocket. In this, when has the money gone out of your pocket? It has gone prior to April 17th. Therefore, the acquisition of shares, to my mind, also should have this kind of a meaning on an interpretation basis. However, if one wants to take a different view and say, no, one wants to go strictly by a literal interpretation and acquisition is acquisition, forget the act of acquiring it. Then also, we all know the concept of this date is grandfathering provisions. Now, before I get into, I do not know if anyone knows, you were there for the RRC, which I had explained this concept. Grandfathering, what does grandfathering mean? Let me first make just in common parlance, what does that mean? Suppose I have a son who has gone astray. He's left the house and completely gone astray. He's had 2-3 girlfriends, and he comes back and says to look, I'm sorry I made this mistake. Can you pardon all my sins and accept me? So I said, okay, look son, from this date, April 17, all your sins are pardoned. I will accept you. He said, but I have done one sin. I already have a child. So will you grandfather him? Just now you said all my sins are pardoned. So I'll say, okay, I will accept your child. No problem. I'll grandfather him. Then he says, there is one other small thing. There is one other child, but who's on the way. Will you accept? Now once I tell him, okay, look, all your sins with effect from April 17 are pardoned. The act of acquisition of the son had happened prior to that. The sin had happened prior to that. Now I can't say that no, son before April 17 and after 17. So when you're talking of grandfathering, and I say all your sins, and this is what is happening in Mauritius. What is the government saying? All your sins prior to this date are forgiven, forgotten, and we'll accept it. So even if one takes the concept of grandfathering, the act of acquisition of the debentures has happened prior to April 17. And therefore, whichever way one looks at it, I would think that one should get it should not be taxable in India. Also, we have some persuasive arguments within the Act itself which suggest that it should not be taxable in India. So 4710 says when a debenture is converted into shares, it will not be a transfer. Rule 8AA says that the period of holding of debenture shall be considered to be the holding of your shares also. So it will be a long-term capital gain. Now, if that be the case, though I acquired the shares after April 17, and Rule 8A says that for the purpose of holding, it will be considered the date of the shares, which means I have acquired the debentures on that date itself. So inherently within the Act also, we have something, a persuasive value to suggest that one should get, that these shares should get the benefit of the treaty. Though technically speaking, I got it or I acquired it post April 17. So this is my answer to 1.2. Now, if we go to a connected question, since we are on the Mauritius Treaty, 2. Now, whatever I have just said, this concept of grandfathering can also be extended to bonus shares. Can also be, because whatever that act of acquisition, so it's like me telling my son whether your girlfriend or wife, whether she's from Cyprus or Singapore or Hong Kong, there's no difference. Whether it's a daughter, preference shares conversion, whether it's a son, bonus share, whichever one looks at it, no difference. So the concept of grandfathering should equally apply in all the situations in mind. Of course, all this is to be tested. But there is a scope, a good scope to argue that it should not be taxable. Now when we come to question 1.4. Question 1.4 says that if I'm getting the benefit of a treaty, and here they are looking into 3 treaties, Cyprus, Mauritius and Singapore, and if a particular transaction is not taxable under the treaty, can GAR be applied in a situation? So let's take the simplest example first of a Cyprus treaty. In Cyprus treaty, there is no SAR post, so to say, the way we have in Mauritius and Singapore. In Mauritius and Singapore, there is the LOB clause, which talks of making a particular kind of, spending a particular amount during a particular period to show that you are not a shell or a conduit company. In Cyprus, there is no such thing. So when there is no SAR in the Cyprus treaty, then like any other any other transaction, GAR would be applicable if those conditions are fulfilled. So we cannot tell an officer, oh, I am under a treaty and therefore you cannot enter into GAR. The object of GAR is, one of the objects is to deny a treaty benefit if there is, and when they look into substance over time. So in a Cyprus treaty, the answer is obvious that GAR would apply. Now let's come to the Singapore Treaty. And before I come to the Singapore Treaty, let me just step back to the two Supreme Court judgments of Azadi Bachao and Vodafone. In both these cases, especially in Azadi Bachao, they said, while interpreting the Mauritius Treaty, that there is, in the absence of the LOB clause, the treaty benefits cannot be denied. So clearly it was accepted that if a particular transaction is taken to take the benefit of the treaty, Supreme Court said, you all know these things are happening. If the treaty does not provide an LOB, then you have to give the benefits. So a lot of emphasis was placed on LOB. In Vodafone's case also, without expressly laying down this, they said we agree with the council, which was Sarvey, that when SAR applies, GAR will, when LOB is there, then the treaty benefit cannot be applied. This was one of the arguments he had given generally. Now in the Singapore Treaty, when you have an LOB, and let us say that, as we all know, the LOB talks of spending 50 lakhs or 2 lakh Singapore dollars in that period of 12 months on the 24 period. Okay, assuming that condition is fulfilled and my LOB is also in that sense met, can an Indian officer yet apply GAR? So normally what happens, the principle in law is specific over general. So if there is a specific provision and a general provision and the issue arises as to what should apply, the answer is obvious that the specific provision will override the general. In the context of treaty interpretation also, there are several cases. For example, FTS under the China Treaty. So if a particular activity is coming under FTS as well as installation, so FTS becomes a general clause, installation is specific. So if the activities of installation, though it amounts to FTS, yet you will be governed by the installation. So even in treaty interpretation, the principle has been well accepted that the specific will override the general, and therefore here the SAR should override the GAR. Now, any principle of law is subject to one exception. All principles of law, and that is unless there is something to the contrary, unless it is expressly stated otherwise. Now that is an inherent exception for all legal principles, whatever I may say. But if the law provides expressly for something otherwise, then that would override. Now, as we all know, in Singapore Treaty itself, Article 28A says that this agreement shall not prevent a contracting state from applying its domestic law and measures concerning prevention of tax avoidance. So, despite the LOB, the Singapore Treaty in Article 28A is saying that one can go to GAR, notwithstanding the principle that specific will override the general, the exception being unless something to the contrary is provided, which is provided in the Singapore Treaty. Therefore, in a situation like this, when the treaty itself is saying, despite the SAR, a GAR can apply, in my submission, a GAR can apply in a situation like this. Now, let's come to the Mauritius Treaty. Mauritius also has an LOB. Of course, there the amounts are lesser. It's 15 lakh and 27 lakh rupees as compared to, it's half the amount which is in Singapore. But in Mauritius, there is nothing parallel to Article 28A. There is nothing in Article 28 which says you can go to GAR. Now, before the Singapore Treaty came in, and after the Mauritius Amendment came in between, the expert committee on GAR, and it is there in public domain, they said, look, if there is a SAR and a GAR, then SAR will override the GAR. They made this statement. My sense is, my guess is, that one would have realized the effect of that this amount of 27 lakhs and 15 lakhs is not a great amount, and one can easily bypass the GAR provisions with that. I think in the Singapore Treaty, the government has been cautious by putting that yet GAR will still apply, notwithstanding the comment of the expert committee on GAR. Now the issue arises, can somebody say Or can we say that look, in Singapore it is expressly provided, here it is not expressly provided. The principle of GAR versus SAR should still apply, and therefore since the SAR is of the LOB, GAR should not apply. Now clearly this has to be tested. The argument of the revenue would be that yes, the SAR is vis-a-vis the monetary amount, and therefore now the AO cannot say, oh, you should have spent 50 lakhs. So he cannot have his own measures, but other things can apply. That is one way to look at it. But I think that is watering down the principle of specific versus general. Because then you're getting into the nitty-gritty. You have to accept the broadly that this was happening in Mauritius, yet the government chose to give only this particular SAR and not GAR. And eventually, how does SAR happen? SAR is nothing but which it actually comes out of GAR. So when GAR is applied generally to tons of people and they realize a particular trend is happening, then they say, why call it a general anti-avoidance rule? Let's make something specific out of it. So a SAR actually is coming out of a GAR measure. When they see something repetition being happening, they say, okay, now might as well, in making it general, we'll make it specific. So in the past, let's say there used to be loans, gifts used to come in, and they were judge-made laws. There was no law which says your gift will be your income. They were all judge-made laws. Then that was a general anti-avoidance rule. They call for documents. Then they say, oh, this is happening too often. Let's come with a SAR and let's give that 50,000 limit. Now, once that 50,000 limit is there, then really going into 25,000 and applying it, again you're getting into GAR. So really the issue therefore comes down to SAR is coming out of GAR, and if SAR is not applicable, can you again go back to GAR, particularly in Mauritius when it does not say so. So I think it is arguable to say that in Mauritius, GAR should not apply. The question is, are we better off in saying that GAR should not apply? That's the question. And here I want to point out, in the Singapore Treaty, in the Mauritius Treaty itself, so we have, when we look at the Mauritius Treaty, the amended treaty, we are all looking at the Article 27A, Para 2, 3 and 4, which talks of shell company, conduit company. And that's where this monetary limit applies. But if one looks at 27A1, what 27A1 says? A resident of a contracting state shall not be entitled to the benefits of Article 13(3)(b) of this convention if its affairs were arranged with the primary purpose to take advantage of the benefits in Article 13(3)(b) of the convention. So, forget that shell and conduit company which talks of the monetary limit. 27A1 itself says if the affairs were arranged with the primary purpose to take an advantage, then the treaty benefit will not apply. Now let us see what GAR says. GAR says an impermissible avoidance arrangement means an arrangement the main purpose of which is to obtain a tax benefit and it fulfills one of the four conditions, A, B, C, D. So it creates rights or obligations which are not ordinarily created between persons dealing at arm's length. It results directly or indirectly in the misuse or abuse of the provisions of the Act. It lacks commercial substance or is entered into or carried out by means of or in a manner which are not ordinarily employed for bona fide purposes. So if you compare the two, in GAR, the onus on the AO, vis-a-vis the Mauritius Treaty I am saying, becomes more. Because in the Mauritius Treaty, all that he will say is, I believe that your affairs are arranged with the primary purpose to take an advantage. Full stop. I don't have to say anything else. If he goes to GAR, first he has to allege that and plus ensure that at least one of the four conditions are fulfilled. Therefore, in a situation like this, to apply GAR really becomes more onerous on the AO and it suits us. So in litigation, as we said, there's always a scope to argue both ways. So though we can argue, depending on how the order is done, we can argue, to my mind, once the SAR is there, GAR should not apply. If he has applied GAR, in fact, sometimes it may be better than SAR and we may not take that argument and say, look, where is the second condition fulfilled? Because on the first condition, there are several judgments of Supreme Court which says merely because I have done something, I have a tax benefit in mind. Suppose I am putting up an industry, or I am putting up a unit in an STPI or SEZ. My objective is okay to get a tax benefit, but what is wrong in that? But other than that, these ABCD conditions have to be fulfilled in GAR, which is not there in the SAR in the Mauritius Treaty. So technically speaking, if I summarize, Cyprus Treaty, GAR will apply because there is no SAR. In Singapore Treaty, though there is GAR and SAR should apply, but Singapore Treaty itself says GAR can apply. In Mauritius Treaty, though there is no reference that GAR can apply, it may actually be in some cases better if GAR is applied over SAR. So that takes care of the second question. Now if we go to question 1.4. 1.3. 1.3. Now we all know that there was this notification November 13 by virtue of which Cyprus has been notified as a notified jurisdictional area under 194A. And we know the effect of 94A is that tomorrow if I am dealing with somebody in Cyprus and that person becomes my AE as per this, the transaction becomes an international transaction, the expenses can be disallowed, and even if I have received a loan, it can be treated as my income. So these are the draconian consequences of 94A. Now the government later on came in 3 years later in December 16 and said they rescinded the old circular with retrospective effect, and since the question says it's amended to retrospective effect, I'm not getting into the issue whether it's retrospective or not. And I think it is retrospective in nature. Now, in a situation like this, if I have suffered because of the old notification, and by virtue of the new notification, how do I put an end to that suffering? So what could have happened? Maybe a demand was raised against me and I did not file an appeal. Maybe I could have claimed a refund, which I did not ask for the refund, and because of the old notification. Today I want to do that, but what comes in my way is the time limit. So if I want to file a CIT appeal, 30 days have gone by, can I do it? Can I make a 154, though 154 time limit is 4 years, but will you say it's a mistake apparent from record? If I want to make a refund application, then 1 year time has gone by, how do I bypass all this? The practical difficulty. So if we take the first situation of an appeal, so an appeal, as we all know, can be filed beyond the period, provided there is sufficient cause for the delay. Now to my mind, this is clearly a case of a sufficient cause because the government is going both ways. First they said they are notifying it, then they are withdrawing it. So why should I suffer because of the government? They could have notified it immediately. They took 3 years to notify. So why should I suffer because of that? Had they notified it at the time when my order was passed, then I would have filed my appeal would have been in time. So I cannot suffer because there is a delay on part of the government. And at that point of time, there was no cause of action for me. The cause of action has arisen right now. So whatever the delay is, I think clearly there is a sufficient cause and an appeal would be maintainable and I can claim the relief in an appeal. Coming next to 154, where I don't have the problem of the time limit because 4 years time limit is there, and now the gap is of 3 years. The issue will arise whether this is a mistake apparent from record. So if there is an amendment with retrospective effect, can that supposed to be a mistake apparent from record? So there are two Supreme Court decisions, 194 ITR 143 NK Venkachalam and 156 ITR 74 GM Bhatia versus GM Shah. In both these cases, they held that when there is a retrospective amendment, but of course there was not a notification. When there is a retrospective amendment, then you have to see today how things stand. So when I am making an application for rectification, is there a mistake in that order today? Yes, there is a mistake in the order. And therefore I can make a 154 application. So time limit is there with me and it's clearly a mistake apparent from record. And coming to the refund, though there is a delay, there is a circular 9 of 2015 which provides that even beyond the period one can make up to 6 years with a condonation application. So in my view, though we will have a slight hurdle in terms of making an application for condonation of delay, one can still get the benefit post the rescindment of the earlier notification. Now, we come to 1.1a and b. So these are the relatively simpler questions, and I thought before we have a heavy dose from our Sunil Bhai, let me give you something. Let's start with something easy, and then we can go on to something heavier. So 1.1a, I don't know if you have read it. So Delhi company was incorporated in India 25 years back. 10 years back roughly, the place of effective management shifted to Singapore. They wanted to expand the Southeast Asia operations. It acquired a 25% holding in a Malaysian company in 2006, which is at a time when the place of effective management was in Singapore. Now, under the domestic law of India, the company is resident if it's incorporated in India, etc., etc. As per the domestic law of Singapore, company is resident if the control and management is situated in Singapore. As per the Malaysian domestic laws, a company is resident if the control and management is exercised in Malaysia. These are the domestic laws of the three countries. If we go to the DTA between India and Singapore, now, so the question is, where is Delhi company resident for the purpose of India-Singapore DTA, India-Malaysia DTA, and Malaysia-Singapore DTA? Because as per the domestic law, it's a resident in India, it's also a resident in Singapore. Now, if one goes to the India-Singapore DTA, then the test is where is the control and management of the company. In the facts, it's clearly in Singapore, and therefore it will obviously be Singapore. It will be a resident of Singapore. If one goes to the India-Malaysia DTA, which also says the talks of place of effective management. Now, here clearly the place of effective management is neither places. But at least Malaysia says if there is a confusion, then one can go to map and try to determine where it is. And maybe one can try to argue at least the incorporation is in India, whatever else. So the answer would be to go to map. And if one goes to the Malaysia-Singapore DTA, then again as per that DTA, the residency is where the place of effective management is situated. Here in the facts, the management is in Singapore. Therefore, it would be Singapore, the resident of Singapore. Now if one gets into 1.1b. This is a case where there is one individual who is having a company, his sole person. So here Miss S is a geologist specializing in oil exploration. She provides the services to various companies. She owns 100% of the shares of S Corp. It's the only employer. And all the services of S services are provided through S Corp. Something like what Amitabh had done, ABCL kind, something like that. An individual but saying I'll do it through corporate body. And so the sole shareholder, everything happening through that. Now, S Corp was incorporated in State X, where S's lawyer and accountant are resident. And the three directors are S, the lawyer and the accountant. Under S Corp's constitution, the shareholders can overturn the decision of the board of directors, which means S is ultimately the karta dharta. There may be board directors, there may be a board of directors, but ultimately the decision is with S. Now, since S's activity is normally required to stay in a country for 2-3 years, she usually becomes a resident of a particular country wherever she travels. The accountant prepares the company's financial statements based on information sent by S. The lawyer prepares a summary of directors and shareholders' decisions, and they are sent by mail to S. She signs and returns them. There are no directors or shareholders meeting. State X's domestic law allows decisions to be approved in writing. State X's domestic law, under State X domestic law, company is resident of X if it was incorporated there, which was so in S. So therefore, as per this, S company is incorporated in X. Under State Y domestic tax law, the relevant criteria for determining the residence of a company, which is S, are factors that indicate an economic link with the country, such as place of effective management, place where the business is operated, place where the board meetings take place, and place where the accounting records are kept. So clearly the economic link is in the other country, which is Y. Place of effective management, because S has effectively the karta dharta has full power, she's in Y, so the place of effective management is Y. Place where the business operated is Y. Place where board meetings take place, answer is no, because there are no meetings taking place. And place where accounts records are kept is X, because the account is in the other state. But if one goes by the treaty, therefore, and this is the OECD model, then again the test would be where the place of effective management is, and therefore in a situation like this, S Co would be the resident of Y. I think with that, in the right time, I finished my questions. Now over to Sunil.
Good afternoon to all. Thanks to Paresh Bhai and the Chamber for this opportunity. In fact, Sunil Jala, I'm in the same position. My full preparation was done by my team, and Alpa Shah is here representing the team that worked on it. I'd like to acknowledge her, and maybe present her a small moment also in the same manner. Even the citation to be given to her, it has my name, so I can't give that to her. But she please accept the memento in place of the citation. And given the timing and the body not to make it too heavy, I try to make it as light as possible. But actually it's a subject which there's a limit to which you can lighten it. And it's a bread and butter Facebook that is not too simple also. So we take up the cases on a permanent establishment, that is Article 5 of the treaties in the OECD model. So the first case concerns an oil pipeline. So the facts of the case briefly are set out in this slide. We have an oil company which is resident in the UAE. It supplies oil all over the world in many different countries in the region through a pipeline with host of different countries. Now, though the pipeline passes to other countries, it is operated entirely from UAE only, from the head office in the UAE. Maybe it's a small pipeline, and the directions and pumping station is in the UAE. There are no people of UAE in any other country like India. And any work done in other countries is done by subcontractors who are fully independent. So all that the company has is its oil pipeline through which its product is being transported through India or any other country. And the question is, will this company be taxable in the country in which its pipeline passes on the sales of its products, on the ground that it has a permanent establishment in those countries? So what would be the answer to that? Now, as you know, the P is a place of business where the business of an enterprise is carried on. Now, can we say that business of the enterprise is carried on through the pipeline, where in a way the product is passing through, so in a way it's carrying on of the business, right? Now, one precondition is that the enterprise should have the right of disposal on that place where the PE is asserted. Now, does it have a right of disposal on the pipeline, on the place where the pipeline passes through? Answer is yes, otherwise you could not put the pipeline in that place and could not maintain the pipeline. There is some protection, it has a right of disposal also. So in theory, it could have a permanent establishment under Article 5(1) as a place of business. But there is one exemption in Article 5, as you know. There is an exemption for delivery of goods. If a place of business is maintained for delivery of goods that belong to the enterprise, then it's automatically excluded. It's a special exemption from permanent establishment. But otherwise, we do have a place of business. Because of the exemption given in Article 5(4), one can get the exemption. Even here, one should be careful because 5(4) gives an exemption for a place for delivery of goods belonging to the enterprise. So if it transports its own oil, then it gets the exemption. If it gives its pipeline to a third party on lease for transporting a third party's oil, then this company will have permanent establishment in the respective countries through the pipeline passes. Because the exemption for transporting or delivery of its own products is not applicable. Likewise, also has the exemption in Article 5(4) for auxiliary or ancillary activities. This can perhaps be said to be an ancillary activity to the activity of producing and refining and selling petroleum. Assuming it's in the total business end-to-end of exploration, production, refining and distribution. Then it will be an ancillary activity and you can claim exemption under that as well. But suppose it's only operating a pipeline and doing nothing else, then it will be an ancillary activity. It will be the main business of the company. So So in that case, we don't have the exemption, and the tax in Article 5(1) will continue to exist as a permanent establishment. Then in fact, a German pipeline case, which I mentioned the name over here, is mentioned in the OECD commentary. In this case, argument was raised by the company owning the pipeline that P is a fixed place of business and therefore it must be on land. It must be fixed to the land or the land itself. The pipeline is underground, so that should not be a permanent establishment. On this, German court did not agree and said that it can be underground as well, it need not be on the surface of the land, so it will qualify as a fixed place of business and would refer to the permanent establishment. So extending this, even let us say communication cables or telecom cables, optic fiber cables on the seabed may also be a PE to the extent to the territorial waters of a country are being covered in the pipeline cables. So this situation you have to keep in mind. If you are doing something for a third party, for transporting signals or products of third party, there will be a permanent establishment. If it's for own product one is transporting, and that's what that is being done, then there's still a permanent establishment under Article 5(1). But we get the exemption under Article 5(4). That was 2.1. The second one is on creation of a permanent establishment upon the presence of a person. Where a service provider is present on the premises of its customer. This is a very, very common situation. Like any consultant, any engineer, any service provider would go to his customer's premises for discussion, for collection of information, for negotiation, whatever, and spend time over there. So the question here is, would the presence of a service provider at the premises of the customer from time to time, would that create a permanent establishment for the service provider in the country where the customer is located? Example given here is of a Singapore consulting company providing IT consulting. One of the employees of the company is present in Poland at the customer's premises from time to time. It's not continuous off-site work, it's occasional visits to the customer's premises, and the facts of the case say that each visit lasts a week, and the year not more than 3 months are spent in all by the person on the customer's premises, which means about 1 week per month is the time spent. And most of the work is done at the client, at the consultant's office in Singapore or in India in this case, and not at the customer's premises. So it's only some meetings and some of which is done at the customer's premises. It's not the only work that is done over there. So with this background, will the person have permanent establishment in the customer's premises or not? One more fact which is told to us is when the employee goes there, there is no fixed place given to him or to her, but she is assigned whatever seat is available at that time. So any conference room or cabin or chair that's free at that time will be given to her for that week or for that day maybe, and next visit it will change. But every week she goes over there year after year apparently. It's a 3-year contract. So the frequency is high, it would be about 36 visits made to the same customer in the same building possible. So the question is, will this create a permanent establishment? Now once again we have to apply the basic test that P is a fixed place of business where the business of the enterprise is carried on. And the ingredients are, one, it has to be a fixed place, meaning a specific location, which is there over here, is the building of the customer. Then it has to be at the disposal of the person concerned. Now over here, is it at the disposal of the person concerned for the week in which she is there at the premises? Every month, once a week, she is allowed to enter the building to do the work. So let's keep that aside. Then also it has to be for sufficient duration to have some degree of permanence. And the general test is 6 months in a year. It's not written in black and white in Article 5, unlike the service PE. But generally if it's more than 6 months in a year, it could be said to create a permanent establishment. If less, it would not be a permanent establishment. without there being a fixed fee. But there's one more idea brought in over here by some foreign rulings, which says that this goes on for a very long time, goes on for year after year, and even less than 6 months in a year would create a permanent establishment. Because the stay in a year is less, but number of years and contract duration is high, and for that duration, the person always has access to the premises of the customer. Now, I think seeing all this, it looks to be a little of a grey area, but here we would be into a situation where it is not a permanent establishment. It's 1 week at a time, there is no fixed praise given, less than 3 months in a year, so it would not ordinarily be a PE. But the last one has not been said on this, it's a controversial matter. And if you see the OECD commentary, the classic example is that of a painter permanent establishment. And the paras are given over here, where different cases of a painter are given. It goes to one place in a building, or many places in the building, and whether a P is created or not. There these principles are discussed, so you can have a look at that to arrive at the conclusion. That's on consultants' permanent establishment. Now we come to deemed accruer in India and residence in India. So, in this case, we have an Indian company which is trading in pharmaceuticals. Now we also have a Hong Kong company.
3.1.
3.1. Now, for the Hong Kong company, the directors are in India and everything is in India except one manager in Hong Kong. So everything is done in India and from India. You only have a company in Hong Kong with a manager for the international business. And the manager looks after sales, but purchases are handled from India by the directors. So it's a Hong Kong trading company. The top management is in India. All decision instructions are in India. What employee executes in Hong Kong. The purchases are from India, and the sales are being managed from Hong Kong. Now, here the question is, will the Hong Kong company be taxable in India? For that, I think first thing we should see is the resident status of the Hong Kong company. It's incorporated in Hong Kong, so at first glance it should be resident in India, but the directors are in India and all decisions are taken in India. So the question is whether it will have a POEM in India. It is today we have the POEM rule, as the law stands today. So will it have a POEM in India and will it have made it taxable in India? With just one manager outside India who takes instructions from the directors. I think as things stand straight away, there is a POEM in India. And the company is resident in India. Now, residence means taxable on global income. Now come to what the company says, explanation 2 to section 911. Explanation 2 to 911, it says that no income shall be deemed to accrue in India on account of purchase of goods in India for the purpose of export. So it says no income shall be deemed to accrue in India, even though you have a business connection in India. In this case, with a POEM, is straight away a business connection in India. Can't be denied. And normal income from business connection and 911 will be deemed to accrue in India. But the explanation 2 has an exception that no income shall be deemed to accrue in India from the purchase of goods in India for the purpose of export. So question is, can they claim this exemption or can they say that they are covered by this explanation 2? Now, if you examine very closely, it first says it's a purchase of goods in India. Now, where is this company buying goods? That's not mentioned over here. Are the goods sourced from India or are they sourced outside India? Is it from India to USA or is it from Singapore to USA? Both is possible, it's international trade. Now, if it's India to USA, we can say is purchase of goods in India for purpose of export. Can we say that it is Singapore to USA? With that qualifies export and with the explanation to apply. Again, some controversy on this, but the latest case which I mentioned over here, it says that for exportable goods that originate from India. So even buying in Singapore and selling to US by an Indian company is export. So if it qualifies export, although earlier the Hindustan Lever case of Mumbai 8080 that said export must be that goods must originate from India. They must be sent out from India for ETHS. But this is the latest case which says that they must originate from India and it is still export auto from Singapore. So with that possibly it will still be covered in explanation 2 with that stretch definition. Now suppose it is covered, then still what happens? Okay, so income goes outside India because section 9 is not applicable. But the company is still resident in India under POEA. So it's taxable on global income. And therefore it should not be of any help even if I cover by explanation 2 to 911. But there is one section to note, that is section 91(1). Now this company is taxed in India based on POEA on global income. But let's say exports are from Singapore and Hong Kong. It's also taxed in Hong Kong. Right, it pays tax over there because it's incorporated in Hong Kong. And there's no India-Hong Kong treaty. So can't claim exemption. Right. Now what about the tax paid in Hong Kong? Now section 91 gives relief in a case where there is no treaty. And section 91 over here, it gets tax credit for tax paid in Hong Kong if the income is not deemed to accrue in India. So your explanation 2 is relevant. So if under explanation 2, if this income is not deemed to accrue in India, then we will get the tax credit on section 91. So the income is taxable because you are resident and taxable on global income, but because you pay tax in Hong Kong and because the income is not deemed to accrue in India, you get the tax credit in India for the tax paid in. So this broadly is the position. Of course, this week's report says that POEA may be dropped. In that case, company will be non-resident. In that case, it will be taxable in India on this income at all.